Well, good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for coming out today to attend our first Wetland Professionals Association forum of the 2019 winter season here, and wanted to introduce a co-worker of mine, Alison Harwood. She works at WPA Associates in our Minneapolis, did work in our Minneapolis office actually, now out of the Burnsville office, and is here today to present about Minnesota Wetland Permitting 101, including the different regulatory aspects and content that's required to successfully complete a wetland permit application here in the state of Minnesota under our regulatory programs. So please welcome Alison Harwood.
Okay, thank you, Sean. They tell me this is working, so this or not. So thank you guys for being patient. In theory, all of the links that connect to the internet should work now. So today I'm just going to do a pretty somewhat general overview of the different regulatory bodies that govern wetlands in Minnesota, what the application requirements are, and then just some items that I've noticed as both an applicant and as a representative on the LGU side of items that are often missed in applications, so that you guys understand what those are, make sure you include them, and overall just make the application process go a lot smoother for everybody. So to start with, we'll just outline some of the objectives, which are to understand overall which agencies regulate wetlands, understand when a permit is needed, and then application requirements. And just, there are a lot of different exemptions and types of permits out there. I am not going to cover every single one. I'm going to cover the ones that are most commonly seen, at least in the metro area. So if you have specific questions about a particular exemption or a particular part of a permit, or a particular part of an application, I can try to answer the question, but you'll probably be better off going directly to whoever that regulatory authority is. So first of all, just a general overview of who regulates waters and specifically wetlands in Minnesota. So at the federal level, we have the Army Corps of Engineers, who regulate through Section 404 of the Clean Water Act, and then also some waters through Section 10 of the Rivers and Harbors Act. There's also the EPA, who administers via the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency, Section 401 of the Clean Water Act. At the state level, there's the DNR, obviously, who administer the Public Water Work Permit Program. And then at the local level, there's the Wetland Conservation Act, who's administered through Bowser, and the local government units. And then also there are some areas of the state that have watershed districts that also have, some of them have regulatory authority over their watersheds, some don't. So you have to just look at that particular watershed to determine whether or not they have authority or not. And then also one thing to keep in mind is that if you're working within the boundaries of a tribal reservation or on land that's owned in trust by a tribe, some of these agencies, particularly the state and local, don't necessarily apply. So you might only be working with the feds in those cases. And this is just a different overview of regulation. I think this comes from Bowser document. So again, you have the federal level, the state level, and then the local level. So when you're looking at it by water body type, many times what we typically do is we look at whether or not it's a DNR Public Water to begin with. And so the DNR Public Waters are regulated below the ordinary high water level of basins. And so the ordinary high water level is determined by delineating the elevation that the highest water level that has been maintained for a sufficient period of time to leave evidence on the landscape, which is commonly the point where natural vegetation changes from predominantly aquatic to predominantly terrestrial. So it sounds a lot like a wetland delineation, except in the case of the DNR not just anybody can go out and make that determination. The DNR has a team of surveyors that does those OHW determinations across the entire state. And so not all DNR Public Waters have OHWs established for them already, and if they don't, and the DNR determines that that elevation needs to be established, then they have to go through the process to establish that elevation in some form before they can tell you where their authority starts and ends. For DNR water courses, the ordinary high level is the elevation of the top of bank of the channel. And for reservoirs or flowages, it is the operating elevation of the normal summer pool. So that is how DNR authority is determined. And so in this case, your DNR authority would occur between the ordinary high water level. If there's any wetland above that level, that is under the jurisdiction, assuming that it's natural, it's under the jurisdiction of the Wetland Conservation Act. All of it is under the jurisdiction of the Corps of Engineers. And so again, quick overview, you have your Army Corps of Engineers, Department of Natural Resources, Wetland Conservation Act, which is both Bowser and your LGUs, the Watershed District, and then in some cases a pollution control agency if you need Section 401 certification. And then there's other, which can be cities or counties, MnDOT, lake associations, other conservation districts, just other more local entities that might have some jurisdiction over whatever body of water that you're looking at. And so now I'm going to go over each of the regulatory entities briefly, talk about types of permits that they have within their program, and then I'll move on to submittal requirements. So the first one is the Army Corps of Engineers, who regulate the filling, dredging, or draining of waters of the U.S. And so generally in here I would talk about how jurisdiction is generally determined and that it's what connects to water in the U.S. I'm not going to do that because that's been changing recently, and so I'm not as familiar with how they're making those determinations. I don't know if we have any Corps people in the audience today. But if you think that your water is isolated, it is not under the jurisdiction of the Corps, then you need to contact your Corps representative and have them make that determination for you for that particular project. But in terms of permits, they have 4 different types of permit vehicles. The first of which is a nationwide permit. So this type of permit is a general permit that authorizes certain activities across the entire country. It does not require an individual NEPA or National Environmental Policy Act document to be completed. There's currently 50 nationwide permits, although some are revoked in Minnesota, and they authorize a variety of activities such as mooring buoys, residential developments, utility lines, road crossings, mining activities, wetland and stream restoration activities, and commercial shellfish aquaculture activities. And the Corps typically suggests planning for a 60 to 90-day review process from the time that you've submitted a complete application or they've determined that your application is complete. They also have what's called a regional general permit, and so those authorize certain activities across the state. There is some of those activities do have non-reporting authorization available, so if you are able to determine that your project fits below those thresholds of that authorization, you don't have to have the Corps review your project for you. If there's any question about whether they fit within that threshold, then you need to submit to the Corps and have them review it and let you know. Again, the regional general permits do not require an individual NEPA document. They typically authorize less than a ½ acre of impact. The exception to that are transportation projects. Those are based off of whether the impacts are part of separate and complete projects, and they have some specific threshold criteria for that. Examples of different types of permits through the Regional General Permit Program are utility line discharges, minor discharges, which are less than 400 square feet, linear transportation projects, wildlife ponds, pipeline repair and maintenance, and beach sand blankets. And again, they recommend planning for about a 60 to 90 day review period on those. And then you get into your individual permit categories. So you have two, one being the letter of permission, which is an abbreviated individual permit, and that's required when impacts from your project exceed regional general permit or nationwide permit thresholds. These do require NEPA documentation, which is typically, if it hasn't already been completed by your project, is completed by the Army Corps of Engineers, and it does require a 10-day public posting. Because of that extra documentation and the extra public process that's involved, they recommend planning for a 4 to 12 month review process if your project requires a letter of permission. And then finally, they have their standard individual permits. And so those apply if your projects exceed all of the other thresholds. These again require a NEPA document, and they also require individual section 401 certification. So the other three types, the regional general permit, nationwide permits, and letters of permission, PCA has waived 401 certification to the Corps for those particular projects, with the exception of a few activities that they don't allow, such as blowing up bridges within the water. But generally speaking, they already include section 401 certification. Individual permits don't, so you have to go through the PCA and get individual 401 certification from them. Again, I mentioned it also requires the NEPA document, and these require a 30-day public comment period. You also have to evaluate offsite alternatives. So combination of 401 certification, which I think they said, PCA said they try to get those done within 120 days, but that's still a pretty lengthy period of time. Between that, the NEPA document, the public process, they recommend planning for almost a year or two of coordination on those permits before you get an approval. And so because of that, they recommend pre-application planning a year in advance. So if you can plan ahead of when you actually apply, you can hopefully shorten that process to more the 9-month range versus the 26-month range. So again, as I mentioned before, with the tribal work within tribal reservations, these particular Corps of Engineer permits don't apply if you're working within a tribal reservation. They have their own Corps of Engineer permits, and I think they might even have different ones depending on which tribe you're working in sometimes. So again, if you are working within the boundaries of a tribal reservation, just keep that in mind, that you might have some different application requirements. And so, as I mentioned, the Corps of Engineers, their planning process and their review timeline tends to be the most lengthy. Things that can cause time delays are, like I mentioned, the NEPA document. So if your project has already completed some of that NEPA documentation, if there's already been an EAW, which is not a NEPA document, but it does have some of that information included, if it has an EAW, if it has a federal EA or federal EIS completed already, include that documentation because that will speed up their process. The second section 401 certification can be a time delay. And then also if you have a project that changes plans frequently, that obviously can cause some time delays as well. The other one I mentioned were the Section 10 permits, and so these are required for work in, under, or over navigable waters of the U.S., or work that will affect the navigable capacity. And so Section 10 water bodies have been designated based on their past, present, or potential use for transportation for interstate commerce. There aren't a ton of waters that this applies to. There is a list that includes all of them within Minnesota. Some of them include the Minnesota River, the St. Croix, the Mississippi, and then for lakes, there's Lake Superior, obviously, the Mississippi headwaters, and then again, there are some other lakes and rivers. There's a list you can get off the Corps' website that includes all of that information. And if you need a Section 10 permit, you also might need to coordinate with the U.S. Coast Guard. And so keep that in mind. Again, these permits, Section 10 permits are not required on very many projects, but if you're working on a transportation project that involves some sort of river crossing, be something you definitely want to look into. The next one we're going to take a quick look at is the Department of Natural Resources. So again, they regulate lakes, wetlands, and streams identified on the public water inventory maps, and they have jurisdiction below the ordinary high water of those water bodies. And so the DNR Public Water Inventory maps, if you're not familiar with them, can be found on the DNR's website. And so they have some really old scanned paper maps that are difficult to read. They have newer GIS-based maps, but then most importantly, they have shape files for all of those water bodies. So if you have any question about whether the water that you're working on is regulated by the DNR, download the shape file, take a look, and then you can subsequently look up ordinary high water information on Lake Finder, or contact the area hydrologist for the county that you're working in. Permits from the DNR are required to construct, reconstruct, remove, abandon, transfer ownership of, or make any change in a reservoir, dam, or waterway obstruction to public water, or change or diminish the course, current, or cross-section of public waters entirely or partially within the state by any means. And so again, I mentioned, if you're not sure whether the water has an OHW, you can go ahead on Lake Finder. It is often a good way to look that up, especially if it's a lake that has a name. Or just contact your local, the area hydrologist for that county. Many of the public water wetlands do not have ordinary headwaters or OHWs established. So if that's the case, then the area hydrologist will make the determination of whether they think they need to establish some sort of elevation, or if they're just going to waive jurisdiction to whoever the local WACA authority is. So a few of the different types of permits through the DNR include the public water work permit. So these are general permits, or there are general permits within that permit vehicle. These are pre-issued permits that are issued either on a statewide or a county level, and there's 5 categories. There's emergency repair for public flood damages, multiple purposes that covers a few different things, bridge or culvert projects, dry hydrants, or bank shore protection or restoration. And as far as review timelines, they typically recommend, or they tell you to prepare for a 60-day decision, or decision within 60 days, and that comes after they determine that your application is complete. You'll get notified when they determine that through their MPAR system. And then there's also, for activities that don't fit within the general permit category, there's an individual permit. And if you have a project that impacts waters that requires an individual permit, you might need to mitigate for whatever those impacts are. And you might need to mitigate on site. It won't necessarily be like wetlands where you can buy credits. And again, the same here, they typically talk about a 60-day decision, review and decision period.
What's a dry hydrant?
I don't honestly know. That's just what they cover. I never get one for that particular general permit category before.
Dry hydrant is like a hydrant that's got a lead out into a water body, so like the fire department comes and hooks up to the hydrant and they pull water out of the lake. Pretty common in rural areas.
Okay, thank you. And then DNR also regulates water appropriation, so dewatering. Many times we see that through construction dewatering. It's required if the amount of water appropriated is going to exceed 10,000 gallons per day or 1 million gallons per year. And if you need to get a DNR water appropriation permit, that amount of water that's been appropriated needs to be documented and then reported to the DNR, I believe on an annual basis. And then they also, DNR Department of Natural Resources, Lands and Minerals Division regulates utility crossings. So those are required whenever a utility is proposed over or under a DNR public water or a DNR owned land. So wildlife areas that are owned by the DNR, if you have a utility crossing those, for some reason, you would need to get a utility crossing license. And again, that's through the Lands and Minerals Division, whereas the public water work permits are through their water resources. And then the Wetland Conservation Act. So most of you are probably familiar with this, became effective in January 1992. Goal is no net loss of wetlands, regulates the draining, filling, and some excavation within wetlands, does not regulate incidental wetlands, meaning wetlands that were created not for the purpose of actually creating wetland. There's a few different types of impact approvals, replacement plans, exemptions, no losses, and then the Board of Water and Soil Resources also administers the local road replacement program through the Wetland Conservation Act for certain transportation projects. So replacement plans are required for projects that impact natural wetlands through filling, draining, or excavation. In order to get to the point where you can get a replacement plan approval, you first have to show that you've avoided wetlands, that you've minimized whatever impact is actually out there, and then provide a plan for replacing for the impacts that are still going to occur. Required replacement at a 2-to-1 ratio or 1-to-1 if you're in northeast Minnesota. Generally speaking, that covers what's required by the Corps of Engineers or DNR. As I mentioned before, sometimes the DNR will require on-site mitigation if you're, say, impacting a lake. They might require you to mitigate for that lake impact within that same lake basin, or the Corps of Engineers might require additional mitigation for certain types of wetlands, or if you're not able to replace for your wetland in one of their bank service areas, they might require some higher replacement ratio. The replacement plans require a minimum 15-day comment period. Generally speaking, it's around a 30-day comment period, and then 60-day decision timeline, and again, that's from the time that your application is complete with the LGU, not from when you submit it. And then there's the exemptions and the no losses. So some activities are exempt from requiring replacement, such as agricultural activities, maintenance of public drainage systems, utility installation or maintenance, de minimis, and then wildlife habitat is another one that is relatively common. And I'll go over some of the more specific submittal requirements for these a little bit later. And then no loss is for work that will not result in the permanent loss of or impact to wetlands. So either it doesn't impact a wetland because there's not a natural wetland there, so it's maybe an incidental wetland, or it's excavation of simply debris or sediment within that wetland. It could be seasonal or temporary water level management, it could be maintenance of utilities, or temporary impacts that are going to be restored after construction. And then finally, the Bowser Road Replacement Program, again, is a program that's administered through Bowser, and it is for local, so city, county, township road improvement projects. It applies to currently serviceable roads only, and they will replace only for impacts resulting from upgrades that are needed to meet current state or federal safety or design standards. some trail improvements that are associated with road projects, and then also stormwater BMPs that are associated with the required improvements are also generally covered under Bowser's program. And again, I'll go over some of those submittal requirements in a little bit. So submittal needs. So first I'm going to go over the Corps of Engineers and WACA just because it's the joint application. So it'll be a little out of order from the presentation. And then I'll go on to DNR and then touch briefly just on some of watershed districts, some of their different requirements, and then a few other things to keep in mind when you're submitting. So I'm pretty much just going to start going through the application itself. This first page is the applicant information. Generally speaking, it's pretty self-explanatory. You fill out applicant information, site information. For applicant information, one thing that's important to note is that if you're working on a project where either land is being acquired for like a housing development, or maybe you're working on a road project and they're going to be constructing a stormwater pond and they need to buy right-of-way from somebody, that landowner might not be the same person as your applicant. So you may need to get signatures from both the landowner and the applicant, or at least provide some sort of documentation that that landowner has given permission for that project to occur on their land. So the LGUs can't, decision on some property that they didn't have permission to be on isn't going to be valid. So make sure that you keep that in mind when you're filling out landowner contact information. And then the other thing I wanted to point out specifically on this first page is a little piece that I see often not filled out. I think it's because there's not a little gray box there, but it's this right here. And it talks about if there's any documentation prior to this particular submittal, so wetland boundary decision, some prior jurisdictional determination, if there's anything else that's been already approved for this project and you have an application number for it, include it there, because that changes a lot, especially if you have 3 or 4 years between when the application or the property was delineated and when a project actually occurs. So that's not going to help the LGU or the Corps or the watershed district figure out what delineation applies to that replacement plan. So if you have either an application number or a Corps of Engineers project number, or any other just prior information about what was happening on this property prior to this replacement plan, include it right there. And even though there's not a gray box, you can still type there. At least in the Word document you can. So that's just one thing that I know my staff knows that I usually point that out to them. So that's one thing that I would recommend from at least an LGU standpoint, is making sure that you have that information there because it makes our jobs a lot easier.
One quick question.
Yeah.
If you were to get a signed letter from a landowner saying that he authorizes this project to occur on his property, and then you just, had the applicant name, and then you said see attached letter, do you think that would suffice, as far as, identifying the applicants, then the applicant can respond back, when there's regulatory issues? Does that seem to be something that occurs a fair amount?
Sure, so you're saying that if your landowner or applicant are not the same person, the
Right.
landowner has provided some sort of signed document that says
Right.
this land is going to be under the control of the applicant
Right.
at some point.
Sure.
I believe that would work. I don't know, maybe there's another LGU. I think that generally works. It needs to be some sort of signed documentation that either an easement or a purchase agreement, that might, what you're describing would probably work too. I would guess if they're at that point, there would probably be a purchase agreement. nearing completion that you could also reference, so, but yeah, just something that shows that there's authority to work on that property.
That's one thing I noticed with the Corps, you send something to them and they send you an acknowledgement letter, and they just move ahead with what you sent in.
Right,
And then sometimes on the WACA site,
yep,
you know, things can get followed up, you know, if you don't have the signature of the old landowner.
yep.
To make that simpler in some cases probably would be beneficial.
Yeah, I mean, yes, you're right, the Corps doesn't necessarily make that check. It probably would be a good checkbox to have, but I think, just generally speaking, if you know that your applicant and your landowner are not the same person, including that documentation of some sort. So the next part in this replacement plan is the impact summary. So within the impact summary, they provide this table, and then that's kind of it within the application itself. But generally speaking, you want to make sure you're including impacts to all aquatic resources, so that's not just wetlands, that's tributaries, that's lakes, that's wet ditches, stormwater ponds. Even if you don't think that it's going to be regulated, still include it there. So if it's a stormwater pond and in your mind you're thinking, well, that's not regulated, I'm not going to include it as impact, still include it there, and then you can describe later in your application why that's not something that needs to be replaced. So include all your aquatic resources. Again, this is kind of all there is within the application for describing aquatic resource impacts. But if you can describe what the impacts to each wetland or aquatic resource is from, that's also very helpful. In general, just being very transparent in your application. So saying there's going to be 1/10 of an acre of wetland impact to basin 1 because they're widening the road 2 feet or something like that. Just so it's clear why the impacts are occurring versus just saying there's 3/4 of an acre of impact on this entire project, but there's 5 wetlands being impacted. It's just kind of answering those questions for the LGU and the Corps project manager and the watershed district before they have to ask them.
Have a comment?
Yeah.
I really encourage people to use a separate line for type of impact, so don't say wetland number 1, drain, fill, excavate.
Sure.
Call them out, because not all programs regulate all of them, and different programs may need to parse those out, so a different row, I guess, for fill, drain, or excavate for each one.
Oh, sure, yeah. Yeah, and then also splitting the impacts by facility, so if you have a road project and there's also a trail that's being constructed next to the roadway, but both of those facilities are impacting the same water body, if you can split that out and say this amount of impact is from the road project versus this amount of impact is from the trail portion, that's also helpful, especially if you get eventually to the point of Bowser replacement, because they may or may not replace for that trail, and then it saves you time in the end of having to go back and have your engineers figure that split out. And then I'll talk a little bit more about impact exhibits later, but I also included, so again, this is what's in the application. This is something that we submitted for a roadway project, and so as you can see, it goes into a lot more detail than this. It's got all the same information plus a little bit more. So, it's got the aquatic resource ID here, which is split into the different wetland IDs, and then there's tributaries, ditches, stormwater ponds, more ditches, the resource type, and then WACA status. So like down here, these were all ditches, so they were all incidental. And then it goes into road impact, fill road impacts, cut road impacts, fill trail impacts, cut trail impacts, and then temporary impacts. So it's really splitting that up so it's easy for the TEP and the Corps to review and understand where the impacts are coming from. And maybe, Sarma, that's kind of what you're talking about?
Right.
Okay. And then getting into the purpose and need portion of the application. So, purpose, need, and requirements. So this is really where you get to tell the story of why that project is important and why it needs to happen. So documenting what the purpose of the project is and being somewhat detailed in that purpose. So not just saying the purpose is to build a housing development, but talking about, the purpose is to build a housing development that satisfies, the needs for this X number of houses in this city, or something like that. And then documenting what the actual needs or problems are for that particular project, or for that area. So if it's a road project, transportation project, you might be documenting if there's safety problems or capacity problems, or, and that's both either current or future. Or if it's a trail project, documenting, if there's a gap in the system, why is it important that this gap is filled? Or if it's a housing development, why do they need the houses? What's the sort of housing shortage? Is it a comprehensive plan? There needs to be X number of houses, something like that. So just documenting what the problems are, and then why they exist, and then also the requirements of the project itself. So what the particular standards or design standards are that the road needs to meet or the trail needs to meet, or if it's a housing development, does it have to have a certain housing density for it to meet the requirements of that city? Documenting that type of information. And then the sequencing portion. So this is your avoidance, minimization, and then replacement portion. Make sure that you're very thorough in this section. So for avoidance, you can use the no build, which is you just don't do the project. There's also a no impact alternative. So is there something you could do where you could still fulfill portions of the needs of that project, but still not impact wetlands? So for example, could you resurface the roadway, but just not widen it? That you would fix the road to a certain extent, but you wouldn't necessarily have to impact wetlands. Could you reconstruct the road, but not construct a trail adjacent to it? Could you remove a few homes from a development that are impacting a wetland? And if those options aren't feasible, then just document why. I often see a lot of, well, yeah, we looked at it, but it didn't work. Well, that's great, but we don't know that you looked at it. So we need to tell us that we looked at all of these different options and they didn't work. So I know in the application it says you're required to have two alternatives, one of which can be the no impact or no build alternative. But if you know that they've looked at additional alternatives, if they've looked at 4 different housing development configurations, talk about all of them. That way there's just no question for the TEP to eventually look at it and be like, oh, well, why didn't you just shift the houses this direction? And it's all in the application already. And again, it just saves time in the end for both you and your client. So alternative designs, again, talk about what they were and then why they're not feasible, why they won't fulfill the purpose or the needs of your project. And then after you've documented all the alternative designs or no build or no impact options, and you've determined what your preferred alternative is, talk about how that preferred alternative minimizes impacts to the wetlands. And so again, don't just say impacts were minimized to the greatest extent possible. Explain how. Was it a road project and they went from 4-to-1 slopes to 3-to-1 slopes, or did they put in a retaining wall somewhere, or did they, make a housing pad slightly smaller than the average housing pad in that development to avoid a wetland? Just include all that information and document how that minimization was achieved. And then if you can also document how much was achieved, That's also great too. I know that's sometimes a little hard to do because they may have done the minimizations really early in the process. But if you are able to document how much, that's also good information to have. And then remember, for the alternatives, when you submit, make sure you submit plans that show what those alternatives are. And if you can submit them on an aerial, that is ideal, versus just a plan sheet that has nothing behind it, because it is hard to get context of what the areas that you're looking at without an aerial if you've really never spent any time out there. So again, include exhibits for the alternatives, and if they can be on an aerial, that's even better. And then finally, the replacement portion of it, replacement portion of the replacement plan. So again, as I'm sure you all know, there's the two options. You can either go with banking or you can go with on-site mitigation. So in here, it's just documenting what your mitigation ratio is going to be, if you're going with banking, how your bank fits within the siting requirements, or if it doesn't, why you couldn't find a bank that fits the siting requirements. Remember, there might be some local requirements that you have to meet, so some cities or counties or watersheds might require mitigation stay within their city or county or watershed, or they might require different replacement ratios for different types of wetlands. So make sure that you are aware of what those local requirements are and are meeting those. And then when you get down to actually identifying the bank, having some sort of proof that you have contacted them and they have credits available, more than just the Bowser or Core website, but that they have the credits available and they're willing to sell them to you. So that can maybe be an email, it could be a purchase agreement, or it could be a withdrawal form that's been filled out with all of that information. And then if you're going with on-site mitigation, which is not a preferred method, but some clients still really like to do on-site mitigation, first of all, make sure that if your client wants to do on-site mitigation, that they really understand what it entails, and they understand the documentation and the follow-up and the length of time that they are going to need to stay involved with that project to make sure that the mitigation plan goes through and is successful. If you are going the on-site mitigation route, make sure you have a clear mitigation plan then that has clear performance standards developed that can be measured on an annual basis. Make sure you have financial assurances identified, and then once you get to the construction phase, that you are making sure that you complete your construction documentation. So don't forget to have the site inspected and certified following construction, and then keep the LGU and the Corps of Engineers, if both are involved, updated on how the process is going. You know, if the construction is delayed, let them know about that. As soon as that construction is complete, get them out on site to do the inspection and get going on the mitigation plan. Very often, I think the LGUs and the Corps have to request updates from the landowners, so it's nice when you just get them and not have to try follow up constantly. So those were the replacement plan portions of the application. And then there's also the attachment B, which is either the no loss or exemption or activities not required in mitigation. So for no loss, again, the ones that we use quite often are sediment removal, incidental wetlands, and temporary impacts. For sediment removal, note that there's actually two sediment removal no loss criteria. One applies to natural wetlands, and then one applies to wetlands that are utilized currently as stormwater management basins. So just keep that in mind when you're picking a no loss criteria to apply. So if you're using, for example, sediment removal, documenting how the sediment area or depth of sediment that needs to be removed was actually determined is something that needs to be included in the application. if you're working through an incidental determination, providing documentation of how that was determined, so maybe historic aerial photos or as-built, if it was like, say, a stormwater pond in an upland area, providing those as-built that show that this was built in an upland area. That's good information to have. And then if it's a no loss based on the fact that they're going to be temporary impacts, then documenting what the duration of that impact is going to be, and then how the area is going to be restored after the impacts are done. And then another key thing to keep in mind is that excavation is allowed in type 1, 36, and 7 wetlands to a certain depth. So that type of impact would also qualify under no loss. And then the exemptions. So whereas under no loss, you could say have sediment removal and temporary impacts under the same application. For exemptions, you can't combine exemptions. So you can't combine, say, a de minimis exemption and a utility exemption under the same project. You still have to show that you've avoided and minimized. So oftentimes I see applications come in where they say what exemption they're going to be applying for and why it applies, but they don't talk about how they avoided and minimized having to do the impact at all. So that type of information should still be included in here. Even though it's not technically a required part of the applications, I still many times fill out attachment C, which is the sequencing portion, so that that minimization and avoidance portion is included. I mean, you can include it right there too, but just making sure that you have some sort of documentation that you avoided and minimized. Some of the common exemptions that I see or that we use most often are the drainage exemption, the utilities, the de minimis, and then I've also seen wildlife habitat a few times. Although for that one, it does require specific design elements and objectives, and so there's guidance on Bowser's website about how you can use the wildlife habitat exemption correctly. And then just some other general considerations. So depending on how long you've been doing permitting, there used to be a different application that asked for a lot of this information. And then when they updated it, somehow it got dropped, but you still get asked for it quite often. So this is just information that we like to include in our applications so that we know that everything that the Corps, hopefully everything that the Corps or the LGU or the watershed district might ask about is covered. So that includes information about threatened endangered species, if it's known. If there's going to be tree removal in the project, talk about the type of trees that are going to be removed, the area of trees, and then when the removal is going to occur. And so that has to do with the northern long-eared bat. Cultural resources, if they're known, if you know that there's cultural resources on the project, or if you know that there aren't, documenting that one way or the other. Talking about erosion control as part of the project, and then also outlining the project schedule, what type of funding the project is being constructed with, and then if there's any other permits that need to be applied for or obtained for the project, to outline that as well. Couple of other items. So this is just maybe more of a pet peeve of mine, but the first 2 pages of the application are instructions. Go ahead and delete them from the application. Or if you don't use the attachment, if you don't use one of the attachments, if you don't use the Bowser Road Bank attachment, just delete it. I mean, just save everyone some server space and pages, and delete the pages that you don't need. Also, make sure that you're submitting to both the LGU and the Corps of Engineers. Even though this is a joint application, and the LGU might notice the Corps of Engineers on their notice of application, Now with the way that the Corps of Engineers assigns their project managers, I don't know if they actually get the notice of applications or if they really look at them. So don't rely on the LGU to get that application to the Corps of Engineers. Make sure that you're submitting it yourself. And plus that just saves time, because if another consultant is submitting as an LGU or sending out a notice of application as an LGU and it goes to the Corps then sometimes thinks that LGU is the applicant and then is sending them all these requests, and it just is kind of a mess and wastes a lot of everybody's time. So that's one other thing to keep in mind. And then, as I mentioned before, when I was talking about the federal process, for the federal permits, if there's been some sort of environmental document completed, so an EA, an EAW, an EIS, submit that application or that document or a link to it to whoever the regulatory contacts are, so that they have easy access, because sometimes there's a lot of really good information in those documents that isn't necessarily going to be in here, or at least you don't have to repeat everything. You can refer them to another document. And so then I also did include on here a couple of links to Bowser's website. So this is just their general website, and there's a wetlands tab at the top where you can look at the Wetland Conservation Act forms and guidance. And so in here you can find the joint application and then a whole bunch of other good information and templates for different forms and how to apply no losses and exemptions and things like that. So that's a good reference page if you have questions about applications, or if you are applying an exemption or a de minimis criteria correctly before you submit it. And then it also included the Corps of Engineers link, and so this is a link to their permitting process, and so it's got information about all of the different permits in Minnesota. There's some for Wisconsin, some tribal, the nationwide permits, and then the regional general permits.
Yeah, also, unfortunately, I don't think the links showed up on the screen.
Oh, they didn't?
As you were describing, but.
Oh.
But I think, if you went on Google and just did a
Okay,
keyword
well,
search of
sorry.
Bowser wetlands page, the wetlands page would pop up, and like Alison was describing, there's a lot of resources on there that have all the forms and, instructions and so
Yeah.
forth on all those resources that you would want when you're preparing a wetland replacement plan application or any other type of wetland permit forms and LGU forms and so forth. So
Yep, okay.
if you haven't heard of that, go ahead and feel free to check that out at your convenience online under Bowser Wetlands page, and then the Army Corps of Engineers St. Paul District has their regulatory page, and I think it's just permits.
Yep, permit information.
Yep.
Okay. And then the other backup portion I wanted to talk about was the Bowser Road Bank. So again, this is administered through Bowser. It allows Bowser to cover for replacement requirements that occur because of projects that essentially bring a roadway up to safety or design standards. So this is the attachment E of the application. If you're filling this out, some of the important things to remember is to make sure that you're justifying the needs of the project really well, whether those needs are safety, capacity-based, if they're design deficiencies, and then also keeping in mind that they need to be based on current volumes and current standards. So, for example, the design requirements for a roadway with a traffic volume of 4,000 ADT are much different than those for traffic volumes of 15,000 ADT. So if your roadway currently has an ADT of 4,000, and they want to construct it because they have some future capacity that they're anticipating, and so they want to bring it up to a capacity of 10,000, that's fine. I mean, they could probably justify that. Bowser won't replace for it. They're only going to replace for anything that's required to meet current needs on that roadway. So both justifying the needs and then documenting the problem. So is there a crash problem? Prove that there's a crash problem. Show everyone the crash data, show how it compares to statewide averages. If the roadway is designed deficiently for the amount of traffic volume that's on it, then document what that traffic volume is, and you can get that from, MnDOT has an interactive website that you can get that information on for, let's say, I don't think I've found a road that it didn't have that information for. So document that. You document what the existing design dimensions are for the road, and then what the requirements are for that particular volume. Put that in a table is a really easy way to do it. So you have your existing proposed, or existing, required, and then what your proposed are. And then if it's a project that involves a bridge, including those bridge inventory reports is also a really good form of documentation. So again, clearly documenting the needs or the problems of that roadway, and remembering that if some of the impacts won't qualify, then separate those impacts out of the ones that will, and then describing what the differences are. So again, you might have roadway improvements that are covered, but you might also construction and trail, and those impacts may not be covered. So examples of projects that do qualify for Bowser Road Bank would be an intersection improvement when crashes are higher than average for that intersection, expanding from 2 to 4 lanes when the current traffic volumes are greater than 15,000. Stormwater needs that are required due to qualifying road projects, trail relocation due to a qualifying road projects, and sometimes filling gaps in an existing trail network when it's associated with a qualifying road project. And that depends sometimes on the location and the length of that gap, but sometimes that will be covered. Projects that do not qualify, new roads don't qualify. Turn lane construction to a new housing development that is proposed. Additional lanes when the future traffic volumes are projected to be over 15,000. That doesn't qualify. Trails to nowhere don't qualify. Trails that are not associated with a qualifying road project. Stormwater needs that are required but are not associated to the qualifying road project. And then shoulder widening that is beyond what the design standard for that roadway, what those needs are. So maybe they want to add an extra 2 feet on the edge of each road just for safety reasons, or they want to provide a little bit of space for pedestrians or something. Again, that's fantastic. Bowser's probably not going to cover it. So that covers a brief overview of Bowser Road Bank program. Yeah.
We just have an interesting case right now where on a development, the city wants a through street, and we can get by just fine with a cul-de-sac. And so we're saying, well, why are we responsible for these wetland impacts when we don't have to have the street? There isn't anything other than pretty much the city would like to have the street go through.
Sure.
There isn't even a safety thing really,
Sure.
With fire trucks, so.
So it sounds like it wouldn't qualify for Bowser Road Bank because it's a brand new road.
Right.
That sounds more like an issue of who pays for the replacement
Right,
versus whether or not it qualifies for something.
right, and that's kind of the conundrum is that, the client is just saying, well, I don't necessarily have to have this road, but, and then so we're saying to the city, well, you should pay for the mitigation in that area. And that just seems logical but then, you know, I don't know. Okay.
Right, yeah, seems logical. Bowser would replace Fort though.
Right.
So that's overview of Bowser Road Bank. And then a pretty brief overview of the DNR Public Waters Permit submittal. Generally speaking, pretty much all of the information that you need for your joint application is also going to go in here. The difference is the DNR has a handy online system now, and so all of their submittals go through the MPARD system. It's going to include, again, a lot of the same information, your purpose and need, your alternatives analysis, your minimization, maybe replacement if it's going to be required. And then you'll probably also have to include some sort of hydrology reports or modeling data for those. And then watershed districts. So there are a lot of watershed districts and watershed management organizations across the state. Not all of them have a regulatory program, so if you're working within one, check their website or contact someone from their office to determine if they do have a regulatory program. If they do, their submittal requirements differ depending on the watershed and the type of project, but in general, you can probably expect to have to submit hydrology reports or modeling data if you have some sort of stormwater or water flowage related project, a drainage report, erosion control plans, wetland buffer plans, in which case you might have to also complete some sort of wetland functional assessment like a MINRAM. They also often regulate floodplain, and remember, it's important to remember that watershed district's floodplain and FEMA floodplain are not necessarily the same thing. So make sure that you check with your watershed district or WMO to find out what their flood elevations are based on. They might have their own models that need to be used. And then project plans. So those are some of the watershed district needs. And then in addition to the submittal applications, the submittal exhibits are also a very important part. And so making sure that those are detailed and easy to follow is also important. So showing plans and impacts over an aerial, as I mentioned before, is really helpful. It's just really hard to orientate yourself with a project that you're really not familiar with if you don't have some sort of aerial background to look at. Showing and labeling all the aquatic resources, so again, that's wetlands, wet ditches, tributaries, lakes, stormwater ponds, anything that has water in it out there, make sure you're labeling it and identifying it. That's really important for the Corps of Engineers especially. And then separating your impact types, so permanent versus temporary, cut versus fill, wetland versus wet ditch versus other aquatic resources, and then again, impacts by facility. So if it's because of a road versus a trail versus a pond versus a housing pad, what have you, just including breaking things down to that level is helpful for the reviewers. And so this example here is obviously a road project with a roundabout, but they also had trails in there, so there's fill from the roadway, there's fill from trails, there's some cut for a stormwater pond, and there's some temporary impact along there for construction. And so it just really lays out for the agencies what exactly is going on in that area. And then again, there are probably some other exhibits that will be needed for, say, watershed district applications. So just making sure you're referring to their individual rules for any of their specific requirements. And then cross-sections, if they are going to apply to your project. You don't necessarily need a cross-section for every impact, but try to choose representative cross-sections for your project. And again, separate them by impact type, duration, what they're impacting, and then facility is also helpful. So here again, the different colors represent different types of impacts. So that was fill from a roadway, I think that was fill from a trail, that's cut, and just the different types of facilities that are causing impact. And so other submittal needs. So just a few other things to keep in mind when you're submitting applications, so that you don't come up against any surprises from timelines or application fees or things like that. So understanding review timelines and whether the decision that you're asking for is going to be a staff approval versus a board approval. Staff approvals typically happen faster. If it needs to be a board approval, there might be specific review timelines that need to be followed. And so you should check with your local government unit, either on their website or contact them directly for specific information related to those timelines. Fees. Some of the agencies require fees. The DNR requires fees. Some watershed districts require fees. And generally, applications are not complete until the fees are paid. So keeping that in mind and keeping your client informed of that so that there's no delay in the time that between when you submit an application and when the fee finally gets paid. Again, signatures from the proposer and or the landowner, making sure that you have the correct signatures or documentation that you need. And then also, again, remembering the local ordinances. So the locals might have different requirements for buffers or floodplain or specific mitigation criteria that you're going to need to keep in mind. And then just a quick overview. So again, there's a variety of agencies that regulate wetlands: Corps of Engineers, WACA, the DNR, watersheds, PCA, and then locals. Make sure you're evaluating your projects early to determine if impacts are likely or if they can be avoided through project planning. Unavoidable impacts require some type of approval, so coordinate with regulatory agencies early, and then thoroughly document your project needs and your sequencing efforts. And again, just try to keep your applications as thorough and transparent as you can so that it's clear to the reviewers what is happening on the project and why it's required. With that, I'll take any other questions that anyone might have. If it's the same development, I would include it still, maybe with the caveat of, if there's like the DNR NHIS typically expires after a year, so, maybe 2 years ago there was nothing found, and, you can talk to your client about, if there was nothing there 2 years ago, probably not a huge deal. If there was something there 2 years ago, you might want to get it updated, but I would still include it, and then, let whoever your client is know that, hey, some of this information might be expired. Can we go ahead and ask for it again? I mean, SHPO is pretty easy. That's like the 48-hour response time from them. But yeah, the DNR one is the one that, generally expires. Yes?
Can you explain off-site analysis a little bit? When it's required, parameters?
Sure. So off-site analysis is required when you need a standard individual permit from the Corps of Engineers. So that's the big one. And, parameters, some of it depends on the type of project. So if you are replacing 35W across the Minnesota River, obviously that offsite analysis is going to be pretty simple because you're not just going to go build a new bridge somewhere else across the Minnesota River. It's obviously going to have way more impact. If you have a housing development, there it's documenting, within the context of maybe the city that you're working in, are there other available places, acreages, that you could put housing development? And why would it not work there? Would there be more wetland impact? Is there not access to utilities or something like that? So documenting that type of information. Yes?
Okay, Alison, you did a really nice job of explaining what sorts of information you need to provide. I just want to make a comment on the other side of what not to do.
Sure.
Don't do a data dump. Don't send
Yeah.
people 300 pages of plans with 3 pages in it they have to pay attention to.
Yes.
So
Yeah.
please, no data dumps, it slows everybody down.
Yep, yeah, I guess I didn't point, I just talked about deleting unnecessary stuff out of the application, but also deleting unnecessary stuff out of the plans themselves. So nobody needs to look through 14 pages of details that aren't, that aren't relevant. So yeah, just picking out the portions of that plan that are relevant, or ideally, if you have engineers that are willing to, having them put together specific plan sheets just for you that are just the wetland impacts and just the cross sections is probably the easiest way to go so that you're not digging through plans yourself. Yes?
Hey Alison, can you describe how one would go about defining segments of linear ditches that maybe are cut through upland soils that wouldn't apply or count toward the replacement requirement? Typically like reviewing soil surveys and so
Sure.
forth.
Yeah, so that gets a little bit more into whether the DNR is going to have jurisdiction over it. But if, you know, generally speaking, if you have a ditch that's been cut through upland soils and does not have a wetland, it's not draining a wetland, so there's not a wetland at the upstream side, generally those are considered wet ditches and would not require replacement. Through WACA, they will still need to be reviewed and approved through the Corps. They just won't require replacement. If it's a wet ditch that it's connecting to wetlands, or it has a wetland on the upstream side, those may not be considered wet ditches. But again, yeah, that's more of a Corps of Engineers jurisdictional determination question, and I don't like to try guess what they're gonna say, so. And then there was another question.
Yeah, when did you start actually implementing the cut versus fill? I first observed it through MnDOT.
Yeah.
I understand like from their perspective, from an inventory type of thing, but from a permit standpoint, it's just a permanent impact.
Yeah, yeah. When did we start doing that? I think it started, well, on in the application itself, it asks for cut versus fill. I think where it might have started coming into question was, so cut within, say, a type 1 or type 2 isn't regulated. So we were trying to split out that portion of it so that our client wasn't having to pay, or Bowser wasn't having to replace for that amount. I think that's where it came from mostly, is maybe when Bowser started running short on credits, they used to just say like, oh yeah, that's fine, we'll replace for it. And then they started running short, and they're like, oh, we really don't have to replace for that, 1/5 of an acre of impact, so let's not include it in there. So, yeah, I think that's mostly where that level of detail started coming from. You're right, generally speaking, it's all an impact, at least to the core. But if you really get down to like the nitty-gritty of types of impact and what is required or what's regulated, sometimes that cut can be pulled out of there and can save your client some amount of money at least.
Right, I guess I wasn't aware of that cut threshold with type 1s and 2s. Now that'd be something where I don't like to see that happening if you're in a type 2 wet ditch scenario. But I mean, you still wouldn't have the impact you're saying if you were actually impacting a type 2 basin with a cut.
So, if you're not going to be utilizing, yeah, a lot of it would probably come if I think where it started was road projects again, and so they were cutting ditches.
Yeah.
And so they were cutting out of like a type 1 or a type 2 wetland to create this ditch.
Right, you're kind of
So-
self-mitigating that way back then.
Right, so
Yeah.
you're kind of mitigating it itself, and so again, it was probably more of an avenue to keep Bowser from having to replace for extra
Right.
area.
I just want to make sure that it wasn't, you're not going to a type 2 basin and cutting and saying you're not mitigating for that.
Right, yeah, I mean, it's like cut within type 1, 2, 6, and 7 just aren't regulated by WACA, just by rule they're not.
Okay.
So it's not maybe so much a part of whether or not it's being mitigated, it's just not regulated.
Okay.
Watershed districts might still regulate it.
And the
so
Corps is going to still get
the
jobs.
Corps is still going to probably regulate it, but as far as replacement needs, it's not always necessary.
Okay, thank you, good to know.
Yes?
This is the one thing that I've run into too is aquaculture exemption. And I don't know whether anyone has any experience with it, but when you have fish, you generally need 15 feet deep of water for oxygen in the winter. And, there's things that you can do to maybe dig out a wildlife pond and then connect it in the upland, you know, to a 16-foot area or something of that nature, but, you know, it just seems like, you know, it's kind of interesting right now because the Corps doesn't really have much of a permitting process for it, and WACA requires a permit from the Corps formally. And so then you're sitting there going, well, we got this exemption, but, you know, it just seems like, you know, there's not a real straightforward maybe guidance written about it,
Sure.
so.
Yeah, I'm honestly not familiar with the aquaculture exemption.
Sure.
I've never
Okay.
used it or had to apply it before, so I'm not familiar with that one.